The Extremist Publishing podcast is endorsed by Heart 200, Scotland's most exciting road trip. Find out more at heart200.scot.
Hello and welcome to the Extremist Publishing podcast. I'm Tom Christie, and it's a great pleasure to be joined today by Professor Joy Hendry, who is one of the UK's most respected voices on the subject of anthropology and the author of, amongst many other things, Science and Sustainability, Learning from Indigenous Wisdom.
Hello, Tom. Yes, I'm here. It's one of the subjects that's close to my heart.
Well, I'm very glad that you're here to talk to us about the subject, Joy, because it is one I think that is especially timely given current interest in the environment and in Indigenous cultures generally. So I'm really looking forward to discussing this multifaceted topic with you. So the first question I would like to ask is, the subject of Indigenous wisdom is one which is emerging more fully into public discourse as the issue of environmental awareness continues to predominate in political debate. How did you first come to be involved in this hugely multifaceted area of research?
Yes, you're quite right. It has not suddenly, but it is gradually becoming more important as people realise that the knowledge that Indigenous people have is valuable. I guess it was when I first went to Canada, a long, long time ago, in the days when young people could say, I would like to go to Canada, and you paid £50 and you got a work visa, which was a long time ago. And it was 1967, and there was an expo in Montreal. And a thing that influenced me and was absolutely stunning was the pavilion that had been built by the native Canadians, who now are known as the First Nations of Canada. And they managed to draw in people to see how they used to live, how the settlers who arrived in Canada were given local knowledge by those people who lived there, how they were helped. And I guess I was influenced by that, and it sat in the back of my mind while I was doing other things, and then gradually came to the fore. And when I went back to Canada to do research, I met, but quite by chance, I met the man who'd set up that pavilion, who'd been in charge of setting it up, and so revitalised my interest in what they were doing, because they had things, I mean, I don't know if ordinary people in this country realise that things we now use every day, like strawberries, the big, lovely big strawberries that we grow here, they came from there. That was one of the things that was introduced. Avocados, potatoes, tomatoes, our everyday food, a lot of it came from North America, and it came because the native people introduced the settlers, and in the case of Canada, it was often the voyageurs, the French who went there and travelled around and traded in furs and things, to knowledge that they had that enabled them to live there and then bring back things to Europe without really giving credit necessarily to the people who introduced them to the ideas.
Now, you've spoken in the past not just of your involvement with the 1967 Expo in Montreal, but also in 2003 you stayed at the Six Nation Reserve in Brantford. How did these experiences come to inform your view on the subject of Indigenous peoples and the way that they've been represented?
Well, I mentioned that I met the man who'd set up the native pavilion in the Expo. He was married to the chief at the time on the Six Nations Reserve in Brantford, Ontario, and he was actually the museum curator at that Woodland Cultural Centre where I was working. So through them, and I stayed with the mother of his wife and her family, and she had 6 children, each of whom was working in some way or another that helped me to learn about the Indigenous knowledge and the value of it. And one of the things that I did while I was there that time, I was looking at how Indigenous people were reclaiming their representation of themselves. So a lot of museums until that time would present Native Americans and Native people around the world as if they'd died out. So they would put stuff they were displaying and describe it in the past tense. So the Mohawks did this, used to do that, as if they weren't there anymore. So one of the things that they were involved in when I was doing that research was presenting themselves as living people who were still, and a lot of what they were doing was art, who were still making art, and that would be on display. So I wasn't thinking about science so much then until one or two things happened. So, for example, I learned about the way that people used to grow plants. There's a thing known as the Three Sisters, which is a way of growing corn and beans and squash together, and each of them helps the other. So the corn grows up and makes a big post. The beans grow up around the big post that the corn is growing on, and puts nitrogen back in the soil as they grow, the beans. And the squash, which makes great big leaves, keeps the moisture in the soil, protects the soil from predators, and actually they all fertilise each other, and they don't need to be fertilised, they don't need to be treated with pesticides, and they grow very substantial crops. And that's what they used to do all over native North America, and down into South America as well, certainly Mexico. And along came Westerners and said, no, that's not the way to do it. We'll have a big field of corn here, we'll have a big field of squash there, we'll have beans growing over here, separated them out. And the monocultures that they introduced are subject to the devastation of pests and weather and other things. And so then they need to introduce pesticides and things that are destroying the earth that was being used in a sustainable way by those people. So that's one of the things I learned at that time that put my interest over into the science. And another thing that happened when I was there that time was that there was an architect who was building buildings, and which he liked to think displayed his native origins. And so he built a school, which was very impressive to me, because he'd done things like he'd built bricks of different colours so that the children would see the different colours of the earth that the school was built on. He put pipes down in 6 feet under, because in the winter when it's very cold, the earth on the top becomes frozen, whereas 6 feet down it's always warm. So the pipes would go down and bring the water back up and contribute to the heating of the building. And he also put a wonderful north-south glass roof on the library, and so when the sun was out, you could see on the library wall the time of day and the time of year. They hadn't calibrated it, but had they calibrated it, they could have measured things like that. So he was using knowledge that had come, he said, through generations to inform his people. Oh, and there was one more thing he did, which was nice, which was he put great big steel girders at the front of the school at an angle, so when it rained, the water would come down the girders and jump about, little drops of water would jump about. And he said, and children can learn the qualities of the water. And he said, I'm using modern technology, but introducing the children to ideas that So that things like that began to intrigue me, and I have a science degree myself, and so when I came back and thought about all the things I'd been looking at on that particular project, I began to think more about Indigenous science.
In the past, you've spoken of the need to gather examples of work that uses Indigenous knowledge for its own value and in its own terms, without necessarily checking that it meets criteria presently understood in Western mainstream science. How far does scientific practice have to evolve in order to demonstrate a gradually increasing global understanding of the intrinsic value of Indigenous knowledge for mainstream concerns?
I think you've you're trying to send me down a path which I wouldn't go down, because I think science, if you're thinking of What do you mean by science? I mean, what are you thinking of when you use the word science?
Well, that in itself is an interesting question.
It is, it's an interesting question, and I think what I might anticipate what you were thinking is something which came out of the Enlightenment. And that's the problem, because we think that we were enlightened, certainly in Scotland and Europe, and learned about science from what happened at that time, whereas, of course, people were thinking scientifically in the Middle East. We got a lot of our ideas from the Middle East, from Babylon, from the maths and different parts of the world. And the Chinese were doing all sorts of things which were recognized scientifically long before the Enlightenment. And I think that what we did was we began to think we've got something special that we've got to take around the world and introduce people to, without remembering that people around the world had developed their own scientific systems. And so let's take China as one example, because lots of people know about things like Qigong and Tai Chi and the way that the Chinese think about energy flows around the body. That's something which doesn't come into our system of medical science. And so we don't understand it, so we tend to think that it's not valid, whereas it's perfectly valid from a Chinese perspective. And actually some Chinese doctors do both. They practice Western medicine and Chinese as well, and they have to have multiple ways of thinking in order to do that, take advantage of both systems. So I don't think our way of thinking about science is ever going to evolve to include everything. We just have to be more open and realise that our system of science is just one. And the problem is that it's become known as mainstream science, and so we're still imposing or trying to impose it on other parts of the world. Indigenous people do all the things that scientists do to justify what they do as science. So they make long-term observations, they test things, they try things, they experiment, and they record things. But the problem is that they quite often used to record them for thousands of years in stories and in art and in pictures and things that weren't recognised by outsiders when they arrived in their land. So I think what scientists need to do is be more open to understanding other ways of thinking, which is where the anthropologist comes in as a helpful person to...
Yeah. Yes, because I think you mentioned, didn't you, a while ago that anthropology was the most humanistic of the sciences and the most scientific of the humanities.
Yes, it's a quotation from Alfred Kroeber, actually, who was one of our founding fathers. And yeah, that's right. I mean, the thing is that anthropologists live with people for so long that they know that they have different ways of thinking. And I went to a wonderful talk once, actually just quite near Oxford, and what had happened was there's a group of primatologists who had brought people that they'd worked with in South America to, how do you describe it? There's a kind of piece of South America that's been created. It's a bit like the Eden Project, where they've created an environment from a different part of the world. And they brought these people from, I think it was Colombia, anyway, people who lived in the rainforest in South America. And they were walking around this recreated rainforest and talking about the plants. And it was really hard to understand what they were talking about, because they were talking in not only a different language, but a different way of thinking about plants and dealing with them. There was a very sad article in an anthropological journal recently, which actually brought tears to my eyes, because the woman had been working, it was with people who grow sago in Papua New Guinea, I think it was. And the way that they used to do it was the mothers would take the children out, and the children would be involved in growing all stages of growing sago, and they would learn about the growing of the sago, which is the basic part of their diet, through dealing with it and through actually being with the sago. But apparently people have stopped valuing that way of learning. And it was very sad, because it was so beautiful that it was a way that you'd have your education and learn about the thing that was basic to your life by just simply doing it with your children. You know, we're always talking about how people need to be educated, but educated in what? You know, if you're educating kids in a society where they grow sago, then that seemed such a wonderful way to do it.
How much effort do you think is being expended in scholarly circles to identify and record projects that make Indigenous knowledge part of mainstream national education systems across the world?
Well, not a huge amount, but it is happening in different places. And I mean, for example, in Australia, which is one of the countries where people have treated their Aboriginal occupant, their Aboriginal neighbours really badly. It's also a place where there are schools that are bringing Indigenous knowledge into the school system. And there's a wonderful exchange between a school in Melbourne, I think it's the Methodist school in Melbourne, and a school up in the northwest, which is an Aboriginal school. And they send children to visit each other. And so they're learning about different forms of education. And they made a little film about a boy who didn't like the school, which was introducing things that came from Europe, into the Australian system. So, and he took the filmmaker out into the bush and led them around and explained to them things he'd learned from his family about, how things grow and how to live out in the country. And that was a really nice little film, because he then came, children went from the school in Melbourne to visit his area as well. So there are also people putting things out on social media about schools around the world and how they're introducing people, but it's I'm not sure how widespread it is. And certainly in New Zealand, if you're training to be in any of the medical professions, you do have to spend quite a lot of time looking at Maori ideas, because there is a Maori man. He's still alive. He became the vice chancellor of Massey University, and he was a qualified doctor and a qualified psychiatrist, and he wrote a wonderful system of how you would get maximum health, and it's based on he did a house first, and then he did it based on the Southern Cross, which is 6 stars. So you need physical health, you need mental health, but to have those to be really good, you also need cultural health. There are 6 of them. I can't remember what they all were, but autonomy was one of them, and being part of a community and a family. I think those were the 6 aspects of it. And in order to be healthy, it's no good just having physical health if you haven't got those other things around you to support you.
That interests me, because I think of Joan Lindsay's novel Picnic at Hanging Rock, which depicts quite interestingly that collision between Aboriginal mysticism and spirituality and a very rigid Western way of looking at society. How long do you think it will be before the sort of collision between scientific models of thought will undergo that kind of study?
I don't know. I'm not really very good at predicting what's going to happen, but I do see positive things happening. So, I do, and I have a son who's filming things like that are happening and travels a lot in different parts of the world. And he and his partner have been in Mexico and Belize, and they've found a lot of, they've been looking for them, so I don't know how widespread they are or how influential they are in the wider world, but they've been looking for people who are revitalising things like Mayan knowledge. And so they were in the Mayan food forest, and there are still people who are using the whole forest to grow all the food they need, all the herbs and medicines they need. And there are people in other parts of Mexico who are revitalising Mexican indigenous knowledge for what the wider general public. I also do know a couple of people who are going around filming different sorts of educational systems where they're introducing, but when it'll be more widespread, it's hard to tell.
Well, it's often said that Indigenous wisdom has a huge part to play in informing science when it comes to health and the environment. Medicinal plants, for instance, which have been used for therapeutic purposes by Indigenous peoples, but which are only now coming to the attention of Western scholarly modes of inquiry. How are these subjects being addressed and investigated by scientists and medical researchers now?
Yeah, actually, there's a lot more been going on, which is quite despicable. So pharmaceutical companies have been going out and finding out about Indigenous plants, knowledge that Indigenous people have, and using it without giving them either credit or, you know, economic benefits, and then coming back and making things out of them that they then, you know, charge the rest of us vast sums for. It's a bit of a scandal. So there are places. I went to Vanuatu, for example, when I was doing this research on Indigenous science, and they are very much aware of what's been stolen from them by pharmaceutical companies, and so they're now being much more careful. In Australia, I went to a place where all their students, Aboriginal students in particular, but other students are welcome to join in, are learning about the knowledge that they have, but they're also taught to be careful about it because they don't want other people finding out. So it's sad in a way, because I met a young man who is training to be a medical practitioner amongst his own Aboriginal people, and he talks about eucalyptus, all the values of eucalyptus. Well, we all know about eucalyptus. You know, you can have menthol and eucalyptus for an inhalation if you've got a stuffed up nose. We don't have colds, he said. We use the eucalyptus, we cure our colds. It's not something that, you know, bothers us. And then in other parts of the world there are people who treat malaria. They know how to treat the malaria that bothers us so much when we go travelling there. It's a difficult position, and people like the Body Shop woman, Anita Roddick, she went around and she's found all sorts of things which are really good for the skin and puts them into her products. And I think she does give people more credit for what she's learned with them. So you asked about scholarship, and it's difficult to predict what's going to happen. I can give you examples in different parts of the world where people are taking these things into account. But then at the same time, well, for example, in Auckland University, there were a couple of people I met, one earth scientist and one engineer, and they were writing for the general public and for anyone who would read it about something which Maoris call taniwha, which is literally translated as a demon. And basically it's to do with the land. So where there's a taniwha, you do not build anything, and because it's likely... And there was a road which was built where they'd already been warned there were taniwha, and it's sinking, it's subsiding. There's a whole series of areas around Christchurch where people, when they were developing Christchurch, were advised by the local Maori population not to build. They were the ones that were damaged during that terrible earthquake, because the Maori know which areas are safe and not safe. And these two people in the university who have university positions, so they've done really well and they're involved in research. I was interviewing one of them, and he said, we had a really good head of department who was listening to us. Now we've got a new one, English man apparently he was, who doesn't want to know. He doesn't think that we have anything of value to tell him. So, you know, it very much depends on individual situations, I think, and people who are willing to, you know, take into account what's going on around them.
Well, I think that leads us into our next question, which is, in what ways do you feel that Indigenous knowledge is being communicated using modern means of information dissemination, such as social media, for instance? How crucial a part does the internet have to play in imparting knowledge which might be ancient in nature, especially if it's previously been conveyed through non-written traditions?
Yeah. Well, I've seen a lot of... partly through my son, who's watching it and puts me on to these things, a lot of young Indigenous people who are putting out not only knowledge about their science, or actually not much about their science, but more about their dancing, the way that they do things, the way they have fun, and they're getting together and on, for example, TikTok is where they will do their dancing, but they get together and do things like saving the valuable seeds that might otherwise have been forgotten. And I think the internet's really important and probably really going to do a lot of good. But it's getting people to follow you, isn't it? That's the problem. They're getting together. So Indigenous people who in the previous generation, in my generation, were put down and were sent to those horrible boarding schools where they were supposed to be being turned into Westerners, then their children have begun to realise that that's not a good way to proceed, and their children, who are the ones who are now using the social media and the internet, are getting together and being able to value the knowledge, and fortunately there are still enough elders around who can help them. So I think it is really valuable for bringing that kind of knowledge out into the wider world. It's just at the moment there's probably a lack of followers who would have an influence in the scientific world as we think of it, as where it needs to go. But there are schools. I mean, there are people who are introducing their children in the schools where they're learning outside knowledge as well, that's come from Europe, to value their own indigenous knowledge. So the school I mentioned that was built by the Mohawk architect, actually they use Mohawk as a medium there, so they're learning Mohawk language. And I met a man who is probably in his 60s, who said when he was at school, before that school was built, but it was being conceived of, he had a teacher who said to them one day, and this man found school rather boring, he said to them one day, have you thought about what the local town that you live in means to you? What the name means, what the history is? And they hadn't, because they hadn't learnt that at school. They were learning all sorts of stuff coming in from Europe. And that day, that man took an interest in school and set about finding out from his elders and from people around. And he became one of the people who worked in the Woodland Cultural Centre. He looked after the resources. That's how I heard the story. So the schools like that now value local knowledge are doing a huge amount for disseminating it, at least to the people who are feeling proud about their own background, whereas 2 generations ago they would be being made to feel bad about their indigenous background.
And one final, I suppose quite far-reaching question, if we are to consider epistemology in its traditional sense of inquiring into the nature and scope of human knowledge, how do you feel we must rethink the scientific method in order to more fully engage with indigenous wisdom?
Yes, well, there's a man called Greg Cajete, a Native American from Pueblo Indians, Tewa man, who's written a whole book called Native Science, in which he argues that there are 3 major parts to that mainstream scientists need to think about. The first is that we think, or we have been thinking, I mean, I think gradually we're realising it's not possible now, that if we learn enough science, we'll be able to solve all problems, we'll be able to do anything. And when we realise we can't do that, because we're actually ruining the world we live in, and which I think is coming through, that'll be one big step in the right direction. Another is that he talks about the fact that mainstream scientists ignore the spirituality in the way they talk about science. And I think some scientists are beginning to realise the value of knowledge that's come through thinking about the world in a spiritual way, as well as the way that they tended to separate from the spiritual. And actually there's one of the people that he introduces in his book is a Blackfoot man whose first language is Blackfoot, and he argues that he studied quantum physics, and probably quantum physicists have a problem explaining that waves and particles are apparently incompatible with each other. He said, if you think about, the trouble is, he said, in English, the English language, when you're discussing that, and probably all European languages, you're talking in such a way that these things take on a meaning which is incompatible. If you were talking in Blackfoot, you don't have to pin everything down to nouns. And the third thing that Greg Cajete criticised mainstream scientists for was leaving themselves out of the equation, so acting as if they could be outside the whole way of thinking, which is clearly wrong, because as we know now, we mainstream scientists and everybody else are interfering. I mean, the Anthropocene hadn't been invented when he wrote what he wrote, but that's one thing we need to think about. So basically, I think what Indigenous scientists are coming up with are ideas about ways in which people can have ways of... There's various ways of expressing it, like dual science or ways of thinking. Thinking two ways is one of the ways that they use in Canada. And I've got a good example to give you, which is in one part of Indigenous or Aboriginal Australia, there's some people called the Yolngu. And they were lucky in a way, because they... in two ways, because the Methodist minister who went to bring them Christianity also found their spiritual ideas interesting too. So they still, to this day, have a combination of inside and outside ideas. And the second thing was that a mathematician who teaches in Darwin University decided to learn their language. And he learnt Yolngu and discovered that in order to teach maths to the children in the Yolngu school, it was much better to start with Yolngu knowledge and move out into learning the maths that the Australian government wants everybody to learn, which came from, well, not actually Europe, but from the Middle East. But anyway, that kind of maths that we all learn. So he got involved, and the children learn, before they ever go to school, they learn from their families around them ways of thinking about geometry, because they know who lives where, in what directions things happen, and about the earth around them. They learn about relationships and who's related to who. And that knowledge comes into the way they learn maths really successfully. So they do really well, those children, through thinking in their own language and then in bringing in the outside. So it's just one small example of how people have suggested, Indigenous scientists and some scientists who are working with Indigenous scientists, of being able to incorporate different ways of thinking into a way that brings both values both, and allows both to... And the example I gave you earlier on of Chinese medicine is one too, because the Chinese way of thinking about the body and the outside way of thinking about the body, if you can be adaptable and combine them and involve multiple ways, because it's not just always just two, but involve different ways of thinking, I think that's the way forward. And that's the way forward that your Indigenous scientists, that are my Indigenous scientists that I'm telling you about, the Indigenous scientists that I met, would argue that would probably work in the long run.
Well, Joy, thank you very much for taking the time to speak about such a complex and important subject. I think with the environment being more on people's minds now than perhaps ever before, it's such an important subject to deal with, and one which I feel is likely to be studied and discussed for so many years to come. So thank you very much for opening our eyes to such a vitally crucial subject.
Well, thank you for inviting me to talk about it. It's a subject, as I said, close to my heart.
Joy's recent book, An Affair with a Village, is available to buy from all good independent retailers and online booksellers worldwide. Thank you very much for joining us today. I hope that you'll tune in again soon.
If you would like to find out more about advertising on the Extremist Publishing podcast, please visit their website at www.extremistpublishing.com for details.